Hello, everyone. It's great to be here and paying a tribute to our wonderful hospital. In fact, I've been writing a book about medicine through the ages in Haslemere for the past couple of years, helped by members of the U3A local history class, which I run. We aim for this to be published during the year to mark this important centenary. All profits from the sales will, of course, go to the hospital. And I hope to whet your appetite on some of the things that will appear in this book. The very first record of any kind of medicine in Haslemere seems to relate to a Robert Schotter, who lived in 1553 to 1639. The vicar at the time wrote that he was an expert chirurgeon, surgeon, French, and cured in his life multitudes of impotent poor people of foul and dangerous diseases at his own charge. So that was way back in the 1600s. Nothing on the subject has been found during the 1700s, but the next known reference appears in Greta Turner's book, Shottermill Part 2. There she says there were two doctors in Haslemere during the 1830s and 1840s, one of them being a Mr. Smith, the son-in-law of the Reverend James Fielding of the townhouse. It was this latter gentleman whom Haslemere history suggests was a notorious highwayman, but that's another story. Mrs. Turner wrote, apart from the treatment of infectious diseases about which little was taught, the medical treatment, whatever the problem, was still primitive by modern standards. Treatment for both physical injury and internal malfunction seemed to be restricted in the first instance to leeches or cupping. It appears these were used for a hernia, inflammation of the eye, and a frequently fatal pain in the head. During most of the 19th century, sick persons who could not be looked after in their own houses were taken to one of the two small pest houses at the north and south approaches to the town. It appears there were no cases in Haslemere of the four great cholera episodes between 1831 and 1866, which had reached Guildford, but smallpox caused several local deaths around 1837. At the same time, a resident noted, many of our people are ill, and scarcely a house in Haslemere but has someone ill with the influenza. This too led to a number of deaths. Greta Turner also writes, there are many references around 1835 to the fever, which it is assumed is typhoid fever caused in ingesting contaminated food or water. Often whole families were ill, if not all fatally, suggesting their living conditions were less than hygienic. Recognition of the need to do something about the supply of good water and the disposal of sewage did not come for another half-century or more. Tuberculosis was another scourge in the 1850s. Local children also suffered from whooping cough and measles, but most seriously from scarlet fever, which struck from time to time. At this time, in 1855, a local doctor gained notoriety for his part in the saga of Inspector Donaldson, the unfortunate policeman killed by drunken navvies engaged in building the railway. As the inspector tried to eject them from the many inns which lined the high street, a fight broke out. In trying to break up the brawling men, the inspector's colleague, Constable Freestone, struck one of them with a truncheon, and the fighting intensified. As the disturbance progressed, a young medical man, Dr. Henry Bishop, was sitting in his house almost next door to the Swan. He went out to help and became involved in the free-for-all, which led to the death of Inspector Donaldson. Despite the doctor's best endeavors, he was unable to save the inspector from the brain damage inflicted. At the ensuing case at the county assizes in Kingston, it was said that Dr. Bishop needed an escort of special constables to ensure his safety from the navvy supporters on the road home. This incident is remembered in Haslemere by a plaque on the town hall wall and a ceremony which takes place there each year at the end of July. Yes. Oh, I pressed my button. That's it. That is the plaque on the town hall, which records the killing of Inspector Donaldson, where Dr. Bishop did his best, but there we are. The following information was gleaned from Marion Dell's book, The Rise and Fall of the English Switzerland. She wrote that it was Professor John Tyndall who influenced the changing fortunes of Hindhead, because it was he who declared that the air at Hindhead was as pure and beneficial as that of the Swiss Alps. He had a wide circle of influential friends, so that his recommendation was soon well known. Hindhead, henceforth referred to as Little Switzerland, quickly became known as a popular health resort, where those suffering from the existing Victorian scourge of consumption, tuberculosis, could benefit from the pure, clean air. Visitors flocked to the area, and celebrities like Tennyson, Conan Doyle, and others built houses in and around Hindhead. They also heralded the founding of several nursing homes, and in 1917, Holy Cross Hospital as a TB sanatorium. According to Dr. Rolston's book, Haslemere 1850 to 1950, the first formal hospital in Haslemere came at the end of the 19th century, when the Cottage Hospital movement was already well underway. It began with a piece in the Haslemere and Hindhead Gazette, dated 30th of September 1896. I suppose that was the herald of those days. This read, "The fatal accident that, not so very many weeks since, befell a soldier cycling down one of our hills will still be fresh in the minds of our readers. To come to the point, which of our readers, we wonder, is prepared to have suddenly thrust in at his or her door this very day the blood-stained and unconscious body of some unfortunate stranger? Is it fair, is it fair to delicate women to ask them to treat their bedrooms into surgical wards and their houses into mortuaries? For ourselves, we feel convinced that our readers have only to know how easily, how economically our cottage hospital may be started and maintained, and they will no longer delay to put the matter in hand." This set the ball rolling, and within 2 years, Haslemere had a cottage hospital on Shepherd's Hill, on the site of the flats now known as Anderson Court. Opened by the Lord Lieutenant of Surrey in June 1898, it was designed and given to the town by local architect John Warnham Penfold and his sisters, Susanna and Kate, as a memorial to their parents. Just in passing, John was the inventor of the famous Penfold pillar box, a replica of which stands outside the Georgian Hotel. His home Penfold sits at the bottom of Sandrock. The gift of the new hospital also commemorated the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. Now, this is the Cottage Hospital. In 1986, to celebrate the 90 years since the hospital in Haslemere had first been mooted, Ted Orchard, CBE, a former mayor and pillar of the town, wrote an article in the Herald to cover the first 25 years until the present hospital was built in Church Lane. His painstaking research unearthed numerous interesting facts and stories about the first cottage hospital. A management committee of 16 of the town's leading residents was set up at the start. In those early days, the doctors provided not only their service free, but also the medicines. The hospital depended on gifts of all kinds, and in the first 3 years, 75 people provided items ranging from an operating theatre to a wheelchair, and other things like kitchen utensils, a sofa, and shrubs for the garden. Church collections were an important source of revenue, with collection boxes placed in shops, the post office, the railway station, and public houses. When first opened, there were 4 beds in the care of the matron, Miss Johnson, but demand soon exceeded supply, and the building was extended to provide places for 2 more patients. During a management meeting held at the rectory in August 1898, it was agreed that patients should contribute from 5 shillings a week towards the cost of their stay. In my calculations, that's about £160 today. So whether that's right, I don't know, but it seems an awful lot. The sign outside the hospital gate in 1910 read, Haslemere and District Cottage Hospital. Visiting hours Sundays, Tuesdays, Fridays. Hours 2 to 4 o'clock. At the time, it was said that the visitors were regarded more as an inconvenience to the staff than a benefit to the sick. From the beginning, the hospital served a very wide area. Haslemere, Shottermill and Greyswood formed the nucleus. After 1900, occasional patients came from as far afield as Hove, Farnborough, Staines, or even London. They were no doubt attracted by the reputation of the consultant surgeon, Mr. Hutchinson. I imagine that was the wonderful man who founded this museum here, Sir Jonathan. Every major operation and treatment of the time was available to patients, from renal to concussion, meningitis to malaria, eczema and rheumatism. The report for 1906 noted that operations normally performed at the largest hospital in the land were also being undertaken in Haslemere. Every major operation, the 4 original beds increased when an extension in 1901 allowed room for 12 beds, 2 wards with 4 beds and a cot in each. There were also 2 single private paying wards, a large operation room and new rooms for the matron and nurse. In 1909, 4 doctors from Hindhead, Shottermill and Greyshot joined the honorary staff, making 8 in all. Electricity was put in 1910, together with some form of central heating. A special subscription was opened in 1912, and Röntgen rays were installed, and an honorary radiographer was engaged. During the war, use of the hospital declined, partly because 4 of the doctors were on military service. Inflation doubled the running costs, what's new, and the hospital faced a large deficit. The response to the building appeal was fantastic, money being raised by local effort and subscription. Much was given in kind, and there was even sufficient money left over to acquire the first ambulance. The internet contains a few annual reports of the Medical Officer of Health, produced for Haslemere Urban District Council. One of the earliest was published for the year 1919, just after World War I ended, and this was reported. The general health for the year has been good, and very definite relief is felt in health conditions since the breakup of the military camps, which led to so much overcrowding and considerable venereal disease, as well as other infections under the conditions. During both World Wars, there were large encampments of Canadian soldiers all around the area, and it seems that the young ladies in Haslemere were very keen to offer hospitality and other comforts to their colonial friends. Several camps and hospitals were set up caring for those soldiers who were sick, succumbing to changes in climate and exposure to different viruses and bacteria. The war wounded also were taken there to be tended. Sadly, many of the soldiers, having survived the Great War, became victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic. Local graveyards at Bramshot and Greyshot became the final resting place for 430 of these casualties. Yes, those are the graves in Greyshot ceremony. Greyshot, sorry. No, I can't think of the word. Cemetery, thank you. Haslemere itself was doing its bit for the war effort, and many large houses were offered as auxiliary medical hospitals and other requisitioned to cope with the number of wounded men brought into the area. Among these houses were Hilda's, now the Muslim Centre on the Hindhead Road, and Church Hill, close to St. Bart's, now known as Pepperham House. A large wooden hut was erected on the tennis lawn at Pepperham, connected to the house where there were 45 beds by a covered way. The hut proved very useful for entertainment and for a church service every week. There were other diversions for the men too. There was even a meet of the Chiddingfold hunt in the grounds. Next one. Another requisition house, now, part of the Royal Naval School in Farnham Lane, or later part rather, was the 50-bedded High Rough Auxiliary Military Hospital under the Aldershot Command. Between May 1915 and May 1918, 1,100 patients were admitted to the hospital. So, yes, this is the High Rough one up at the top of Farnham Lane. As well as the hospitals, the Red Cross set up workrooms where local members and helpers could prepare and roll bandages, dressings, bed equipment, etc. There was one at Portsmouth and a second at Cordbeck on Museum Hill, while the rectory maintained a splint room, which had 30 members. Dr. Ralston has another lovely early memory. For those who never knew from those early days, a doctor who worked at the Cottage Hospital was told of a case of appendicitis. It had only recently been normal to operate on such cases in the acute phase. Prior to this time, a patient was housed in a medical ward till recovery from the attack should take place, or, as in not a few other cases, perforation. It was at this latter stage that the desperately ill person was transferred to a surgeon in the last forlorn hope. However, on one occasion, an acute case was seen in the hindhead area. The decision was taken to remove the patient to hospital for operation. A message was sent on foot to the Haslemere ambulance station, which then boasted a stretcher which could be mounted on a wheeled chassis. This was solemnly pushed up to Hindhead, up the hill, by a squad of ambulance men, and the patient removed in the same way back down to the hospital. The patient survived this time lag, the crew transport, and the subsequent operation. As Dr. Ralston wrote, some folk then were tough, mighty tough. He continued, the epilogue must not be omitted, for this illness occurred on a Sunday. When the doctor arrived at the hospital and announced that he intended to operate on the new patient, he was met with this remark from matron. But doctor, we never operate on a Sunday. But for once at least, the matron and met her master, and a successful operation followed. The last matron at the Cottage Hospital, Miss Davenport McPhee, came from Churchill Military Hospital in 1919 and moved to be in charge of the current hospital in Church Lane when this opened 4 years later. As Ted Orchard wrote, the initiative and faith of those who had started the hospital was crowned with success, and in succeeding years, the hospital gradually grew to provide the needs of a growing population. Great credit must go to the hard-working committee who were efficient and realistic in their management, far-sighted and bold in their decision, and scientific and modern in their outlook. Now, after another 100 years, this is still an enormous challenge to those who are responsible for their legacy. Thank you. Oh, I meant to say now that Rose Parry is possible.
The second white-haired lady. It's really nice to see so many people that are ex-members of staff in the audience. Gives me a bit of confidence because I don't like to be front of the house. This year, it's the centenary of the hospital. The actual date was the 20th of January. This is us, this is me, out on the patio. But luckily, COVID restrictions were still in place, but we were able to be outside for the occasion. I've got 20 minutes to cover the items listed. I just need, Margaret, could you just put your hand up when I've done 10 minutes because I'm done. And then 5 minutes before the end of my 20 minutes. There's so much that you could put into this story, so it's going to be quick. These are the staff that transferred down from the old hospital to the new. As Faye said, they were bold, they were pioneers, and they knew where the hospital services need to be developed. And they had a plan in place when the new hospital was considered. Obviously, health and safety wasn't an issue in the old days. They were able to play cricket along with the building. The vision for the new hospital was very inclusive, and they knew that they needed lots of space for this to develop. And they obviously needed the public alongside them to generate the funds required for the hospital to go ahead. Well, these vehicles, lots of fundraising went on in the town to raise funds. And in fact, the monies raised were over and above what was thought required. And as a result of that, they were able to do a bit more of the development than first thought, which was to build a porter's lodge and an ambulance, purchase an ambulance. This is our local gang of local builders who, this is in 1922. How on earth they built this huge hospital in 2 years, I know not. But the work they carried out, and it was completed promptly within 2 years. These are the grounds in the early 1930s. When I looked at the grounds, when I first saw this picture, I thought of pride and respect for our community. My husband said if you've got the flowers for visiting, you could pick them up, you could pick a bunch en route. They were wonderful, you know, what a place. Well-being was very high on the agenda. And there were a couple of private beds at this time, but actually this was for all of us, no matter what walk of life we were in. The vision that they had for medical staffing and the additional skills, therapies to provide a good, a decent hospital service were included in their initial plans. This is George Ward in 1925, early days, but there was, if you see the small children, a mixture of children and older people, but the activity in the hospital was increasing so much, but with the initial plans of the hospital, they were able to enlarge these wards in 3 different stages. They were around the shortage of staff that they suffered during the First World War was well noted. So when they set up the new hospital, they also set up a nursing school. And this was opened in 1927. Sir Richard Garton, who I've got mentioned on the screen, he funded the build of the nurses' home. He also funded the children's ward and a couple of private beds that went above it. The training school, as you can see, was in place up until the 1970s, when they then joined in with the Guildford School of Nursing. The children's service. I mean, I was a patient in this ward then, and the only thing that I remember was the beautiful rocking horse in the middle of the ward, which it jumped on and got told off. Fundraising was amazing in this town and the villages. And I suppose there was a sense of pride that the hospital was developing, was a pride of place in that community. During the Second World War, I don't know whether you know or not, but 2,000 evacuees were housed in Haslemere and the surrounding villages. And Denise, another 12 large homes turned into orphanages and sanctuaries for displaced children. With the outbreak of World War II, Dig for Britain was key, and those beautiful gardens were transformed into this amazing vegetable patch, allotment, giant allotment, that most of us that live in Haslemere will remember. I found it quite fascinating when I read some old South West Surrey Health Authority notes when they were going to transform this garden into to house the health centre on site. It said these wonderful crowns of rhubarb that belonged to Fred Hack, who was the gardener at the hospital, should be dug up and taken to Milford for the TB patients. There's obviously now a housing estate, I think, on the old kitchen garden at Milford. In 1945, as we all know, the coming of the war, there was huge housing developments took place on site, took place in Haslemere and the villages. The people that fought in the war were promised a home on their return. And in preparation, I found the committee and the doctors in Haslemere did a wonderful job on making sure forward planning was at the forefront. And although there was talk about the new NHS, they were determined that Haslemere, before it went over to the NHS, was fully kitted out, and they purchased and restored St George's Wood in Haslemere, and they bought a nurse's home, a country house in Haslemere called Kemnal for nurses, for additional nursing staff. So they tried, their plans to develop the hospital and keep it going were absolutely amazing. This is St George's Wood. It's a beautiful old house. The medical staffing, when they employed 2 consultants, surgeons and other physicians to work in the hospital, it provided a rotational placement for junior doctors. So they were trying to develop interest in rural sites to encourage maybe doctors to settle in the area once they completed their training. And the GPs in Haslemere and other villages supported the consultant. In 1980, as the 2 surgeries in Haslemere from either end of town moved on to the hospital site, Dr. Stewart, who was at the Health Authority, felt that as the consultants left, the GPs could move in as clinical assistants and hospital practitioners. And actually, some of the doctors in the audience today were very much in scrubs when I first met them, assisting the surgeons with the operation. The private practice in Haslemere also joined in with rotation to help manage the patients on site. The surgery was maintained in Haslemere up until 1986 for the Guildford hospitals. And there were 5 specialties here. They were general surgery, vascular, orthopedic, gynae and ENT. And all of our GPs assisted the surgeons in those specialties. I remember Mr. Stiles telling me, who was the orthopedic consultant, he did the first Guildford knee replacement here at Haslemere. And I'd had a request for a patient to come in from a different consultant. And he told me that there had been a surgical division meeting, and the surgeons in Guildford, who did not have Haslemere as an outlet, were a bit angry because the consultants in Haslemere had no waiting list, whilst they were struggling to get their patients into Guildford. So Mr. Stiles took a couple of Mr. Shah's patients. In 1986, when the surgery went back to Guildford, Dr. Jean Stewart, who was a director of public health, became very aware that the young neuro patients in our district were having a very poor service. So she made it her decision for for the patients to be brought to Haslemere and to build a unit which would provide lots of different treatment regimes for these patients, different modalities. I think that neuro patients got very short change. They ended up often in long-term rehabilitation because they hadn't been rehabilitated properly. So the Godwin unit commenced, and it had a wide range of outpatient, inpatient. The Cedar Bungalow was converted so that people could maybe go in there and stay with their relatives so they could get used to looking after a severely disabled person at home. So she tried to cover the full spectrum of care required for this patient group. For the nurses, and some of those nurses are here today, they had to learn a whole new skill set to actually look after these people, because they'd been used to nursing people with surgical problems, and now they had to learn neuro rehabilitation skills. And they did it with grace, and they did it really well. And when Dr. Gray, who was a rheumatology consultant in Guildford, took over the management of the Godwin unit, he made it thrive. He absolutely made sure that it had gone from an old, stale mode of treatment to a very active and intense service for this patient group. Then we come from the transition of A&E to minor injuries. Many of you might not know, but Haslemere was part of the major trauma service, and its responsibility was from Milford to Petersfield, and from Dockenfield to Dunsfold, and all the villages in between. At the top, we have the old hut. Most A&E departments in days gone by were wooden huts. The health authority at the time thought that they could manage to move the major trauma to Guildford, but it would not be able to cope with the more minor activity. So they set up a proper minor injury service here in Haslemere, and that was managed by the GPs. We had they had their own dedicated surgeons, consultants in the early days, but as they retired, that was taken over by the GPs. And the GP, the employed doctor for the minor injuries department worked 9 till 5, and out of hours it was covered by the GPs and by us nursing sisters. And we muddled along for a few years, and then skills changed for nurses, and we were so lucky here in Haslemere that we got some excellent A&E nurses who were able to say, yep, if we do those courses, we can begin to operate a nurse-led service. So they did minor injuries courses, they did radiology, they did prescribing. And sure enough, when Leslie Forrester, who was the director for our trust at that time, said, Rose, you've got to make this A&E, this nurse-led. I said, okay, but what happens to the under twos? And she looked at me. I said, they're not allowed to look after under twos, although Julia told me that they're just young adults. And she said, oh, well, as a result of that, I was allowed to keep the GPs for one session and they would be around for the treatment of under twos. So, and in 2004, the health authority, before they discharged their responsibility, said to, I got a phone call one day and said, "Are you still operating in that old hut?" I said, "Yes." They said, "We can't hand it over like that. Can you very quickly put a business case together for a new build? And it's got to be up very quickly." And I thought, oh God, the trouble is they told me about it, but they forgot to tell the people in charge. So we got 250,000, and the quickest build was a modular build. And I was so fortunate that the girls who worked in minor injuries and outpatients, because they worked at that time as a single unit, were able to very quickly put together a plan for a new build, which included a proper minor surgery area, a decontamination, a recovery, and it linked together very neatly. So here is the new build, which is modular and cheap. And I put this old picture in because at the moment you can't see the front door. COVID, we had to change the layout. And when I went down to take a picture, the people that I walked the dog for, that gentleman that you see with the stick, that's Dickie Davis. And if you watch Zulu, he was Sergeant Jones. And he said, "Well, you've got to have somebody young and you've got to have somebody old." So, so it's my grandson, who's now 6'1", toddling along, clutching Gay's Teddy, and Dickie doing his bit with the stick. As always, the NHS is always looking for money. So you get the phone call, "Can you do some estate rationalisation?" Well, we can have a look. So we did a bit of a swap round on site, and we brought the ambulance service over to the hospital site. The mental health team vacated the lodge, they moved in the back, and the social services were in the back of the hospital. And then the nurse visitors to the elderly in Haslemere approached me because in their visits they realised that there was a shortage of services for people with dementia, and they wondered if there was anywhere on site that they could use. So I approached the League of Friends who built the recreation hall for nurses, and they were happy, provided they could have their ATMs, for us to use the building. So with a business case to our chief executive, we were able to free up the use on minor injury on the Marjorie Gray Hall. And it was originally opened, as you can see, by Her Royal Highness Princess Alexandra. Like all things, you know, something works well, it goes on for a while, then somebody comes with a new idea, oh, people should be treated at home. So the day centre closed, but as you can imagine, it's not easy dealing with a dementia person at home all the time, because they don't like people, their loved ones, to be out of their sight. So after a couple of years, it reopened. And in this picture, you can see Dr. Anne Hunter, who was a founder member of the Alzheimer's Society, and Barbara Jeffers, who'd so strongly worked so hard for the first unit in that picture as well. Seems such a shame, because you go off like a rocket and then things have to change, and then they say, oh, this failed, so you start again. The other thing, that initiative that we did in Guildford, Royal Surrey was always really good at giving us initiatives, is they were short of endoscopy space. So could we do endoscopies at the hospital? So we run an endoscopy service for a couple of years, and then they have a new unit, so it all goes back up the road. Again, with imaging, they needed some additional imaging done. And they said, oh, they approached me to say, you know, is there a way that it could be done at Haslemere with maybe mobile units? So for a couple of years, we run an imaging service at Haslemere for MRI and CT. Then, of course, more space comes up in Guildford when they build a new centre, and up it goes. Service stops, and up it goes to Guildford once again. COVID. I don't think anybody thought that such a pandemic would strike this country, and certainly it hit the workforce and people like a sledgehammer. And I know that during this COVID pandemic, that the MIU staff at Haslemere, because they were trying to stop patients having to go up to Guildford, that they extended the hours in Guildford and in Haslemere. And to meet these requirements, the head of governors at the Royal Surrey told me that the staff had worked phenomenally well at Haslemere to cover an enhanced service at Haslemere, as they bring along some consultants from the Royal Surrey to work with the staff in Haslemere. Obviously, since January of this year, the service here at Haslemere is now 7 days a week, and that's much appreciated by the general public. I suppose for me, I've always recognised the vulnerability of rural hospitals. They're not high on the agenda. When rural hospitals were given over to the NHS, it was supposed to provide essential services, but certainly for hospitals such as ours, they sucked the cream and the jam out. So often we were with the drag ends, but despite that, we soldiered on. The League of Friends, which I'm now chair of, they have worked so hard over the years to provide those nice extras which benefit patients. And sometimes it's really hard because you think, have we just the cash cow? You know, do they really appreciate what we do? And we have quite mixed discussions in our meetings. But at the end of the day, no matter what, patients come first. And even if you spend your money and it only lasts for a couple of years, for those couple of years, local people have benefited by that. Mm-hmm. A new chapter of healthcare is on its way, and hopefully with the support of our community and others, we will continue to provide a robust health service locally. For me, our community might have to fight a bit harder because they've joined health and social care together. And in our locality, we border on 3 counties. Our doctors provide care into 3 counties. In the old days, when you had a community unit, they had contracts with a cross-border. So you always had an inclusive service. How it's going to work out being separated into this is done in Surrey, this is done in Hampshire, and this is done in West Sussex, I know not. But we have always had to fight our corner. I'm sure we will continue to fight our corner. Oh, hello, Janet, the 3rd white-haired lady.
Hello, well, I'm going to tell you what it was like to work at Haslemere Hospital. I can't do 100 years, but I can do 50. First worked there in 1950 as a St John's cadet, working on Elizabeth Ward and Princess Margaret Rose Ward after school and on Sunday mornings. And I finally left in 2000, just working Monday mornings in minor injuries. In between, I had several positions. I was a receptionist to earn some money in some school holidays, a nursing auxiliary because no medical school would take me and I had a year to fill in, and then various posts as a doctor. The hospital when I started was run by 3 people, the hospital secretary, matron, and the assistant secretary. Matron and the secretary changed rapidly, but the assistant secretary, who was Peggy Blocky, I think some of you will know, sadly I couldn't find a photograph of her. She worked there for about 30 years, also serving as an almoner and a social worker, and her door was always open to any patient or member of staff who needed help or advice. There were 5 wards, sorry, George, Elizabeth, Mary, Margaret Rose, and the private wing. George and Elizabeth had 16 beds in a 2-bedded side ward. Mary had 5 beds used for gynecology only. Margaret Rose had 10 beds or cots and 2 side wards, which were used either for very sick kiddies, infectious cases, or teenagers who, unlike the slide we've seen before, weren't put into adult wards. The private wing had 4 rooms plus 2 smaller amenity rooms where patients wanting privacy could pay for their board and lodging but still receive national health care. That is Elizabeth Ward back in the early 50s. As you can see, it's somewhat different. The beds are all lined up. The patients are lying to attention. What do you say? Was that the? Ah, yes. That is Sister Hannaford, who I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of. She was a legend. Ward sisters they ruled supreme in their ward, and Hannah was particularly so. She was a lovely person, but didn't suffer fools very gladly. When I started as a doctor, I used to do a 9 o'clock ward round. If I opened the door and found that the air was blue, I crept out and came back later. But her patients loved her and her staff respected her. No day surgery. Shortest stay but hoped for was 2 to 3 nights, and the average 2 to 3 weeks. Visiting was restricted to a couple of afternoons a week and weekends, and an hour in the evening. So life must have been very boring. And the highlight of the week was ward cleaning, which was carried out by the porters, Mr. Hack and Mr. Brown. Well, Mr. Hack was at least 10 inches taller than Mr. Brown, and they could outdo Morecambe and Wise any time. And by the time they'd pushed the patients around at breakneck speed, teasing them and joking all the time, the mood had lifted considerably. I started work as a senior house officer, which I think now is called an F2, in 1961, when Haslemere was a fully operational acute hospital, and we could do anything that St Luke's or the Royal Surrey could do, other than neurology. We had no neurology beds. There were 2 full-time doctors.
Sorry, wrong way on this.
Oops, sorry, I didn't intend to do anything with it.
Next one to the right, that's it.
Okay, sorry. I was a junior doctor and I was lucky to work with John Clifford Smith, who was the senior, the surgeon, and there was another person to whom Haslemere Hospital owes a lot, because he served for about 25 years. The work was divided. Clifford looked after general surgery and orthopedics, and I took care of medicine, gynecology, ENT and children, and we shared casualty. We were supervised by consultants. Our general surgery consultant was Mr. Jack White, who I think just worked at Haslemere, and the other specialties were covered by consultants from Guildford, who came once a week to do an outpatients, a ward round, and probably an operating session. And they were also available for any major disaster that we couldn't handle ourselves. Casualty. Well, as Rose said, it was a wooden hut tacked onto the back of the hospital. There was a large room, which was the main feature, was a large sterilizer that was bubbling away most of the time. And there were 2 small rooms with couches for examination and consultation. It was also the outpatient department, so you can imagine that the sister had a bit of a job shifting people to the right department. As minor injuries were dealt with in the big room, and they were mixed with all the patients waiting for outpatients. As Rose again has said, it was the accident centre for a stretch of the A3 from Milford to Petersfield, and ambulances brought in all sorts of casualties: road traffic accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, strokes, football injuries. We had an excellent X-ray department, but it closed at weekends. So at weekends, if we needed an X-ray, arms and legs, we could do ourselves, but anything more complicated like heads or chests, we had to either ring one of our kindly radiographers who might be at home and might be willing to turn out and help us, or get someone from Guildford. I think we need another picture. That's the children's ward. The sister there is teaching student nurses how to put up a steam tent, which we use for treating babies and toddlers with croup or breathing difficulties. We got next. Oh, that's Clifford. I couldn't find an earlier one, and I know there is someone in the audience who will recognise herself in that. Won't you, Anne? Right, operating theatre. Not like Holby City or ER, is it? Right, that is a drum into which the nurses had packed dressings, dressing towels, swabs, instruments, which then went into the sterilising room in the autoclave, well, fit for use. They then had to lay up the trolleys for each operation. Nowadays, it all comes from a central sterilising department, and all they've got to do is open the top and go. I do wonder though sometimes, because I hope there are no surgeons here, but we know they're quite temperamental people, and it was fairly easy if the favourite instrument was missing from that trolley, but I don't know how they manage now, if they've got to go right down the corridor and fetch it back from somewhere else. But and you note that the nurses are wearing their ordinary nurse uniform underneath their gowns. And oh, and yes, the window. There was no ventilation or air conditioning. So in the hot weather, we opened the window and operated in the fresh air. We had quite a lot of unwelcome visitors that way. No birds, as far as I know, but lots of insects. And on one occasion, a large bumblebee came in, and the anaesthetist squirted it with a can of oxide, which is a plastic dressing used to cover over wounds. Luckily, the thing dropped on the floor and not in the wound. What have we got next? That is, I don't know if they still do it, but orthopedic surgery, if you hold the arm up for long enough, the blood drains out, and you put a tourniquet around, and the surgeon has 10 minutes to operate with no blood. If you leave it on any longer, the arm drops off. What have we got next? This is the last operation performed in Haslemere Hospital Theatre. It's not very good quality, but as you can see, it's a lot more relaxed than back in the 50s and 60s. The theatre closed in 1986, and two things hadn't changed. We still had the window open to let the fresh air in, and although there was a changing room for the surgeons, the female staff had to use the store cupboard. Back. Right, well, I left from that job in 1962, and as far as I know, nothing much changed in the hospital until, other than the closure of the children's ward until about 1975, when the hospital was no longer accredited as a training hospital, and the supply of senior house officers dried up. So Dr. Andrew Ritchie, I think, press-ganged 9 local GPs to take over the running of the medical, gynae, ENT beds. And that worked very well until late 70s, when Clifford retired, and then we took over the whole lot. 2 doctors did general surgery, 2 did orthopedics, and I did gynecology, and the rest of them looked after the medical beds. Well, talking of orthopedics has just reminded me of Rose's story of the first Guildford knee. I was honoured to be allowed to hold the instruction book, not that the surgeon needed it, but it was there just in case. Then I think it was the late 70s. It seemed to be a good idea to close all small hospitals, and Haslemere was threatened. And I can remember meetings after work in the evenings, and one rally that we organised with loads of local residents helping us. And we marched to the hospital and congregated in what is in the car park of the health centre. The then health minister, who was also our MP, not the present one, was inside and declined to come out to meet us. But we must have done something right, because the hospital is still open. It's still serving the residents of Haslemere and around. And I think that maybe even the powers that be must be pleased it didn't close, because it does relieve the Royal Surrey. Thank you. Thank you. Can I introduce Angela and Zoe, who are going to tell you about the future, I think.
Close to enough.
So good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting us here today. How do we follow that? So I'm delighted to be here. My name's Angela Davis and I'm the Associate Director of Operations for Integrated Community Services. So working for the Royal Surrey, but very much based out here at Haslemere and Milford Hospitals. And this is my colleague Zoe.
Hello everybody, I'm matron for Haslemere Hospital. I started working in Haslemere about 8 months ago. So I know Rose very well from the League of Friends, and yeah, thank you very much for joining us on today.
So I started in this role last month, so I'm very new, but delighted to be here. My children go to Graveswood School and I live locally, so my personal life and my professional life is very much rooted in this area. So it's a real privilege to be here and join this long line of history, part of Haslemere Hospital. It's very special to come and speak to you today as part of the centenary year celebrations. What a time for me to come and join. And as we've heard, there's a rich history rooted in the lives of many local people here in Haslemere.
So over the years, the hospital has changed and evolved. And just looking back at what the speakers have said today, what an amazing transition. Today it has 16 inpatient rehabilitation beds. We run numerous outpatient clinics, such as podiatry and the MSK physiotherapy unit. The physiotherapy team have developed services that include elective orthopedic and trauma recovery, post and prenatal musculoskeletal problems, and pelvic health issues. Haslemere Hospital is a real asset to the Royal Surrey family. We see nurses, healthcare assistants, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and hotel services teams work alongside GPs to ensure patients with frailty and complex needs receive the care they require closer to home. Despite the challenges of the last few years, our wonderful staff have made Haslemere feel like less than a hospital and more like a home away from home. It's the small things that make a huge difference to our patients, such as the lunch clubs we've managed to restart, the Pat Dog service, the dementia-friendly activities, and we hope to restart the visits from Haslemere Museum. We have recently set up a collaboration with the Hunters Centre and now have access to their patient activities, such as carer support services for carers looking after patients with dementia and family members, the mobile farm to come to the hospital, and tea parties. These initiatives provide an opportunity for patients to interact socially, enhancing their mental health and social well-being. We are delighted that the minor injuries unit is being increasingly well utilised and is a real alternative to the emergency department. Much more convenient than the local, for the local population here, and it is now open 7 days a week. And patients are being seen within 4 hours and normally much, much less. We've had great feedback from our patients. I'm now going to pass over to Angela, who's going to talk to you more about about changes in the NHS and how that affects us here in Haslemere.
Thank you, Zoe. And the minor injury unit is continuing to stay open 7 days a week and is seeing increasing numbers of patients, 400 this last month. So many of you have worked at the hospital and are perhaps more familiar with the NHS, but I thought it would be helpful to position it. The NHS is a complex system and sometimes it's difficult to understand. It's made up of a range of organisations with different roles, responsibilities and specialties. These organisations provide a variety of services and support to patients and carers. Over recent years, there have been changes to the way the NHS is structured and works. The likelihood is that you've not necessarily noticed this. It may not have affected how you access your local doctor or hospital, but the changes have affected who makes decisions about health services and who holds the budget to pay for these. So let me explain. When the NHS was set up, it focused on treating a single condition or illness. But since then, our healthcare needs have changed. More of us are living longer, and many of us have complex conditions that require regular, ongoing care. This was not reflected in the old NHS structure, which saw many organisations work independently. For some years now, health and care staff and leaders have been working to bring organisations closer together and better meet our needs by working in a more joined up way. What does that mean for you and the people of Haslemere? So as you know, Haslemere Hospital is part of the Royal Surrey NHS Foundation Trust, who also manage the Royal Surrey County Hospital in Guildford and Milford Community Hospital. The trust sits within Surrey Heartland's integrated care system, which brings many organisations together across a large area in order to plan and pay for healthcare and services. Surrey Heartlands, ICS, gets most of its money from NHS England, who are the national body for the NHS in England and sets out the national priorities for the entire healthcare system. The strategy we have across the Royal Surrey, which includes Haslemere Hospital, has to be aligned and to reflect that of the national team at NHS England. So this is just a diagram to show you how that all works. And there are so many acronyms and constantly changing names for things. So what is our local strategy here? Well, in line with the national drive, we are focused on working together and integrating with partners across Surrey Heartlands. We're establishing virtual wards, including hospital at home, for patients living with frailty. This means allowing patients to receive the care they need at home, including in care homes, safely and conveniently, rather than in hospital. Patients are treated and monitored at home by a multidisciplinary team through daily visits tailored to each patient's needs. And technology will play an increasingly significant part in the care we provide. Being able to monitor patients at home will reduce the need for some face-to-face appointments. For example, blood pressure monitoring that can be reported to clinicians via an app. There are many current digital developments taking place across the Trust. Last year, in collaboration with Ashford and St Peters, we launched a new electronic patient record, which is known as Surrey Safe Care. This consists of a series of software applications that bring together and digitalise clinical and administrative data to replace paper-based records. One of the key benefits of this system is that healthcare professionals from both organisations can gain immediate access to information about patients' care and treatments, irrespective of where it was received. Other examples of sharing data include the Surrey Care Record, EMIS in community settings and GP practices, and image sharing across South East England through a shared provider. All these new systems should improve processes and increase the safety and efficiency of our patient care. Looking further into the future, we anticipate more use of artificial intelligence and robotic process automation. The community hospitals have been part of the Royal Surrey family for the last 5 years, and we are keen to build on all that we've achieved in this time. On the horizon, there are some exciting new developments coming to our community hospitals. There are new diagnostic facilities being built at Milford and opening over the next 18 months. Here at Haslemere, we will soon be opening a new phlebotomy suite and a maternity hub in a refurbished part of the estate. We will be keen to make more improvements to the building and are looking for what other services we can provide from Haslemere in the future, making best use of the services available. And having heard what you ladies have spoken about, there's been lots of changes over the years. The NHS does continue to see challenges both nationally and locally, and I'm sure that can't have escaped you. We're seeing a rapid increase in demand for our services against a backdrop of significant financial challenge. Again, nothing new, and vacancies in our workforce. However, we feel very optimistic and positive about the future and are passionate to be part of your local NHS team, and it's a real privilege to be here.
Finally, we'd just like to say thank you to all of you, the residents of Haslemere, and personally for the League of Friends for all the support they have shown. The latest being the purchase of a new bladder scanner for the inpatient wards at Haslemere, and also the contribution they've made to this event today. Thank you and congratulations to everyone who has worked so hard in Haslemere over the 100 years. It's a wonderful place today.
We do have a short video, if we can make the technology work. So we're just going to see if we can get that to play.
Some of the audience recognise themselves.
We'll just see if we can get some sound. We'll go without that. We'll go without the sound.
Do we just fill in the blanks?
Yeah. You don't know where it's gone now.
We've lost some of the technology. Thank you very much.